because by throwing money into the system, you create an illusion of prosperity, you create artificially low interest rates, and if you're going to die in 6 months, that's a good way to go. Because at least you think you're prosperous for the last 6 months of your life. But the problem with this kind of monetary policy is that economies don't die. They keep going. And if you wind up throwing a lot of sand in the gears of your engine so that the monetary policy isn't doing its job correctly, that's when you can get Y2K. I assume people remember that. Everyone was concerned when we turned the clock to 2000 that all these computer systems were based on just 98, 99, and somehow when we went to 2000 it was going to cause all sorts of technological havoc. Well, whether or not those were just computer engineers trying to bid up the prices for their services, or whether there was actually some real legitimacy to it, the Federal Reserve engaged in a lot of money creation because they were afraid that we were going to hit a bump in the road. And I think that's one of the reasons why the economy then hit a rough patch in 2001. Now, obviously, the terrorist attacks compounded matters. So there's always many factors that influence an economy. But I think the Federal Reserve, by gyrating its monetary policy from being too easy, and then once they're too easy, they realize they have to soak up some of that excess liquidity, and so then they get too tight, but then they go back and become too easy. And when you look at more recent history in the U.S., and you look at how incredibly low interest rates were, those were clearly not market-driven interest rates. That was the Federal Reserve intervening and creating too much liquidity in the system, and that resulted in bidding down interest rates below the market clearing level. Now, monetary policy is probably the most challenging thing to look at. And so a lot of us who were worried about this and complaining about this, we had people make very legitimate points, or they would give us very legitimate questions. Well, if there's too much money being created, why isn't this showing up in higher long-term interest rates? Because in theory, if you're creating too much money today, it's going to work its way through the system and show up in higher prices in the future, and those higher levels of consumer price indexes should mean that interest rates go up because there's a bigger inflation premium. In other words, if you think inflation is going to be 5% 10 years from now or 5 years from now, and you're a lender, you're going to make sure to charge at least 6 or 7%. You're certainly not going to charge 4% because you're going to lose money. And so whenever there are inflationary expectations in the economy, you expect to see rising long-term interest rates. And we didn't see that. And that, I want to confess, that was a challenge for us. Why weren't we seeing those higher long-term interest rates? Now, more recently, those long-term interest rates are showing a little bit of movement, and we certainly are seeing higher gold prices, which are another indicator that people sometimes look at in terms of trying to gauge the market's reaction to monetary policy. But then you look at things like inflation index bonds versus regular bonds, and we're still not seeing, we're not seeing higher future inflation being built into those interest rates. So it is a bit of a mystery. And I want to be, I want to be as honest as possible. I think that there has been too much money creation by the Federal Reserve, but it's not a 100% case because we're not seeing the types of signals that we saw, say, back during the Jimmy Carter years, when interest rates were skyrocketing and we clearly had these big inflation premiums being built into interest rates. But getting back to the entire purpose of this discussion tonight, what is the state of the U.S. economy? My argument, my assertion, is that we've hit a bump in the road because of monetary policy. I actually think that we had inflation in the system, but the inflation was showing up not in higher consumer prices, but in higher asset prices. In other words, that liquidity had to go someplace It wasn't bidding up consumer prices, it was bidding up asset prices. And so just as you can have artificially low interest rates distorting market signals, you can have artificially high asset prices distorting market signals. Now, I don't want to blame it all on monetary policy. Free markets, unlike the stereotype of some critics, free markets don't mean that there's always a perfect equilibrium. Free markets are, by definition, a learning process and a discovery process, and especially when you're talking about new technologies and globalization, markets find their way, and mistakes are an inherent part of the market process. And the beauty of a market process is that there's an incentive to learn from those mistakes. So even if monetary policy was perfect, it's quite likely that some of the new financial innovations and the subprime mortgages and things like that, which in the long run are positive, because you're figuring out new ways to deliver services to people in a way that generates profits for sellers and better outcomes for buyers. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to hit a bump in the road and make mistakes as people learn how to incorporate the new technology and learn what's the best way to measure risk and things like that. So I think we've had a combination of factors in the U.S. economy. I think monetary policy unquestionably is number one, and it was mistakes by the Federal Reserve, mistakes that I think are still ongoing. And combine that with an inherent part of markets to learn from new technologies and to occasionally have a hiccup or hit a bump in the road as they deal with that. Now, the question is, and I'll go ahead, I'm sure I'm probably going on close to my 20 minutes here, so let me go ahead and wrap up on this. The question is, where do we go from here? As I've already indicated, I think we have a problem in that the Federal Reserve continues to pump money into the system. And I don't think that that type of inflationary monetary policy is the solution. We had to go through a lot of pain and discomfort in the early 1980s to get inflation out of our system. And Ronald Reagan deserves a lot of credit for having the courage to say to the Fed, no, do not turn on the pump. Your job is to bring inflation down. And yes, we had a very painful double-dip recession in 1980-82. But Reagan held firm. He gave Paul Volcker the support of the Fed to bring monetary policy back to where it should be. Well, unfortunately, we're beginning to forget some of those lessons. Monetary policy, being a Federal Reserve governor is like being a former alcoholic. There's always the danger that you're going to just go into the bar one night and say, oh, this easy money, I can just take a sip or two and I'll be okay. Well, then they take three drinks the next night and 5 drinks the night after that, and sooner or later, you're back to an easy money policy. And I think that's the risk. And I certainly think that the Bush administration has compounded the damage because they're not sending the signal to the Fed to protect the value of the dollar. And by the way, I mentioned the price of gold. Certainly the falling value of the dollar vis-a-vis the euro and other currency is obviously another signal. Again, there are mixed signals. We're not seeing what we expect to see on long-term interest rates, but we are seeing on the price of gold, the value of the dollar versus other currencies, we're seeing some signals of inflation. So I am worried that monetary policy has been wrong and continues to be wrong. Now the question is, what else will happen in the U.S. economy? We have a situation where we clearly had asset prices too high. And whether it was because of monetary policy, as I hypothesize, or whether it was just a bubble that happened all by itself, in some sense, that's irrelevant. How do we fix the bubble? The best way to fix the bubble is just to let it burst. Get prices back down to their market clearing level as quickly as possible. Once you finally get prices down to their market clearing level, then this great uncertainty in financial markets can be solved.